1944, Arnhem. Candles guttered on a wooden altar turned triage table. Cold light cut through dust and the smell of wet wool and cordite. A Red Cross armband lay on Henry Whitmore's palm, its white cloth trembling as he tied a tourniquet. Footsteps on stone, the creak of a stretcher, a small ampule clinking in a tin tray. Outside, distant artillery rolled like a slow ocean. A pale man was hauled from a cart, lips gray, breath a thin whisper. A British corporal lay steady on the next stretcher, cheeks smeared with mud, but talking. "He's the enemy. He's a patient. Orders, no mercy for spies. My oath is to that first." Henry felt the weight of the paper in his breast pocket, that order, and the pulse under his fingers rising back to life. Marie pressed the lantern closer. He reached for the bandage and then for the armband. Mercy where hate was expected. In a ruined church, Henry Whitmore held a Red Cross armband in one hand and a paper order in the other, and the choice bent the room's air. The medical oath tugged like a compass needle. Treat the wounded, regardless of uniform. That quiet, stubborn choice would define a night of bandages, whispers, and a small defiance against a loud command. If stories of courage under oath move you, consider subscribing. Henry's hands trembled. Marie tightened the tourniquet with blunt, certain fingers and pressed the armband back onto his sleeve. The corporal squeezed Henry's shoulder and mouthed, "Do it." The lantern threw a small island of light over fluttering bandages. Outside, the guns kept rolling, but the choice in that circle was silent and absolute. Arnhem, September 1944. The aid station was an improvised field hospital inside a bombed church. A few stretchers under rafters, a single lantern, and a small team trying to hold a line between streets of rubble. Henry Whitmore was a young British medic recently assigned to the para sector. Marie van Dyke, a Dutch volunteer, knew every alley and every danger of calling a wounded man civilian or enemy soldier. They treated parachute infantry, local civilians, and the occasional captured man with papers that did not match his tongue. Supplies were thin. One ampule of morphine passed between hands, bandage rolls rationed, a stretcher borrowed and returned, and shelling could send the whole place into the cold dark at any minute. Triage happened fast. Patients sorted by who could be saved with what was on hand. It is a clinical choice more than a moral one. The Geneva Convention promised protection for the wounded and for medics, but on the ground lines blurred and orders sometimes contradicted care. The medical oath sat in Henry's memory like a steady rhythm. To save the dying man first, regardless of uniform. Oath over orders. Mercy over propaganda. A cart groaned into the churchyard. Splinters and rainwater made the floor slick as two men dragged a canvas stretcher through the door. Henry stepped forward, hands already reaching for bandages. The man on the stretcher was thin, breath rasping, a coat buttoned to the throat, and a paper identity thumbed into his palm like a plea. His tongue-shaped words that Henry barely caught, German syllables folded into exhaustion. Marie cupped the lantern, throwing a narrow cone of light over a pale chin and a mouth working for air. "Careful with his neck," Henry said, voice low. "He's breathing," Marie replied, fingers quick. "Enemy or not, keep him warm." They lifted the stretcher onto two trestles and checked for bleeding first. A pulse too faint for comfort, cold skin clammy with shock. In the cramped air of the improvised field hospital, every motion is both medical and moral. To staunch hemorrhage, to warm a sinking man, to count the supplies left for the night. Henry wrapped the first bandage with the speed of habit, then paused to hear a name the man whispered between breaths. No proof, only sound, the act of touching him, palms on shirt, fingers on pulse, was its own verdict. Mercy began at the fingertips. A bell of distant shelling made the rafters shudder as two stretcher bearers returned with a second patient, a corporal with a hairline cut and a face still able to laugh at small things. He glanced toward the pale man and then to Henry, then squeezed Henry's shoulder as if lending permission. Rumors had run ahead of the cart. The pale man had papers that did not match his accent. Someone had said "spy" in the street, and the word landed like a stone. Orders were a hard paper in Henry's pocket. No mercy for spies. The corporal's wound did not need urgent care. The other man might not live until morning. "Orders say otherwise," a junior sergeant muttered from the doorway. "My oath is clear," Henry answered, voice steady against the scrape of canvas. "Do what you must," the corporal mouthed, eyes wet and stubborn. Triage meant assessing who could be saved with the resources at hand, a decision framed by pulse and breath rather than paperwork. Henry's fingers found the suspect's wrist and felt a pulse returning, slow like a tide. The choice was technical: apply tourniquet, warm, start veal. But it was carried on a narrower current, the promise he had made before the war to save the dying man first. He rotated the ampule of morphine in his hand and then put it back. One ampule could ease pain, but it might also keep someone breathing through the night. Treatment became a ledger of seconds and bandage rolls. To bind, to sew, to give an ampule. Each was a weight against the paper order. Later, on a low bench by the altar, Henry set to work on a shallow wound along the suspect's side. The lamp smelled faintly of tallow. His gloved hands moved with a surgeon's economy, cleaning, approximating flesh with quick sutures, knotting with threads that had been cut down to make small lengths. Marie handed him instruments on demand, her thumb pressing a flat ampule of morphine into his palm when the man's breath hitched. The ampule was little and precious. Morphine eased shock and pain. It calmed the heart and bought minutes of cooperation. Henry eyed the corporal watching, then pressed the ampule, whispering as he injected the drug. "It will slow him, but keep him calmer," Marie said. "Steady now," Henry murmured to the patient, as if he could hear English through the fog of opiates. The act of giving morphine to someone called enemy soldier felt like a small rebellion, a quiet application of the oath in the face of an order. Each dose was a ration against both pain and prejudice. The bandage rolls dwindled. Henry tore a strip and wrapped it twice, thinking of home bandages taught by peacetime hands, and of the Geneva papers that said, "Wounded must be treated." His hand moved with routine and restraint. Stitch, compress, tie, watch. In the narrow world under those rafters, medicine was a ledger of choices where restraint could save both the patient and the team. Night thickened beyond the broken windows. The makeshift ward filled with the rasp of breathing and the soft clink of a spoon against a tin cup as someone tried to swallow. The pale man slept with a photograph folded in his palm. Henry saw, by the lamplight, the edge of a child's face and a small dog. He did not look like a spy at that moment. He looked like someone who had once lived other days. A little later, the man started to cough, a wet sound that laced the air with fear of infection. Language was a wall and a bridge. Marie sang a nursery rhyme softly, syllables slipping into Dutch and then into German, and the coughing eased. "Johann," Marie guessed aloud, holding the photograph closer. "He keeps opening his eyes," the corporal said, voice soft. The ward was a place of small dignities. Blankets smoothed, faces washed when water could be spared, a cup of broth held under trembling lips. A medic's touch was a translation, a way to say, "You are not alone," without words. The Geneva Convention offered a legal framework, a promise that wounded men and medics would be protected. In practice, that protection was thin and depended on recognition. the armband, the lantern, the discipline to mark a man as patient and nothing more. The photograph folded beneath a trembling hand reminded Henry that the human behind the paper could not be reduced to the words scrawled in the street. At 2 a.m, the church door slammed and boots echoed. An officer with a clean map and cleaner anger entered, his eyes cold and appraising. He stepped among the stretchers, glancing from patient to patient, and then his gaze stopped on the pale man. The officer's voice was sharp enough to cut the soft noises of the ward. "You are treating a spy," he said, the accusation a blunt instrument. "He is a patient," Henry replied, holding the bandage with both hands. "You know the orders. You are risking your command." Tension tightened like a splint across the room. The officer threatened paperwork, a court-martial, the danger of being labeled soft on those who might betray. Henry felt the gravity of a life that balanced on a paper order and a bandage roll. He kept his voice low and factual, naming the medical facts rather than the politics. Pulse returning, breath stabilizing, wound closed. The officer's threat was real. To defy orders in the field could mean punishment, loss of rank, even risk to one's life if the chain of command sought a scapegoat in a chaotic retreat. "Your duty is to save who you can," Henry said finally, quieter than the accusation, but louder than fear. The officer looked at the corporal, at the bandaged hands, and then at the timer of the man's pulse. He stepped back without a formal answer. The cost of sticking to an oath was not only bureaucratic, it was the slow erosion of safety for the unit, the passing of whispers that could become bullets. Henry understood that restraint had a sharp edge. It cut him away from easy obedience and toward an ethical center that could isolate him. Yet the bandage was still in his hand, still binding skin. His decision was visible in the way he tucked the Red Cross armband back into place, a small white promise over a soldier's sleeve. Dawn crept through shattered glass when the rumble of evacuation vehicles reached the street. The convoy would take the wounded to a field hospital farther from the front. Priorities would be checked again, papers re-examined, names called. Loading was slow and methodical, stretchers balanced on shoulders, men lifting men as if lifting themselves out of the mud. The pale man stirred, and in a voice thinner than cloth, whispered a name, Johann, and a photograph slipped from his hand and floated to the floor. A corporal from another unit bent and picked it up, looking at the child and the dog, as if the image might answer questions the papers could not. "Thank you," the corporal on the bench said suddenly to Henry, surprise in his tone. "Keep your head," Henry answered, as if that could encapsulate both thanks and command. Marie folded the armband, wiped a smear of soot from the white cloth, and tucked it into her apron where it would not be lost. She passed Henry a small, clean bandage, and he fastened it over the suspect's side with a motion that was more ritual than necessity, a way to close the night's ledger. The convoy doors slammed, the engines coughed, and men who had come as enemies in rumor left as patients under canvas. When they closed the church door behind them, the ward felt at once emptied and altered. The decisions made in that lamp-lit circle would travel with each man. The injured corporal who had lent his permission with a squeeze of the shoulder, the officer who had left without formal sanction, the Dutch volunteer who had wrapped fingers in the work of saving. Each act of care had a cost and a ripple. Henry carried the memory of a hand done up in bandage and a photograph folded into a pocket. The night's choices would be audited in whispers, perhaps in formal reports, but in the quiet of the convoy, the simple fact remained that a pulse had been returned to life by an oath kept in silence. The convoy bumped along a ruined street, and the field hospital smelled of diesel and boiled cabbage when they reached the tents beyond the canal. Stretchers unrolled like quiet promises. Orderlies moved with practiced economy, sliding wounded onto plastic frames and checking names against a clipboard. Henry watched as a young lieutenant in a crisp jacket, cleaner than the rest, leaned over the pale man and ran a gloved finger across his papers. "He's marked for interrogation," the lieutenant said, voice flat. "Mark him for care first," Henry replied, stepping forward with a steady tone. "That's not my call," the lieutenant answered, glancing at the officer's tent. They wheeled the suspect into a dim bay under a canvas marked with a red cross and tore open the dressing to check the wound. The cut along the ribs had closed in crude stitches. Infection risk was the immediate danger. Henry cleaned the skin with boiled water and a strip of cloth, rechecked the pulse, and adjusted the makeshift IV. Salt water, drip slowed to conserve fluid. Every movement was an economy lesson. One syringe shared, scissors blunted by rust, gauze cut into narrow strips. "Where are you hurt?" Marie asked gently, fingers steady as she smoothed the blanket. "Here," the man rasped, tapping his side, eyes unfocused. "Stay calm," Henry said, pressing a cloth to the wound. A medical log needed to be written. Date, injury, treatment. But the lieutenant hovered. Henry penciled the entry, and under the line for remarks, wrote simply, "Treated and stabilized." The entry was a quiet refusal to let paperwork become a weapon. It recorded what medicine had done when orders might later try to unmake it. The Geneva Convention was not a line in ink alone. It depended on someone in the tent deciding that a wounded man was a patient first. Henry felt the weight of that legal promise in his hand as surely as he felt the pulse under the bandage. When interrogation came, it came with men whose uniforms smelled of tobacco and certainty. An intelligence NCO arrived with a notebook and a hard stare, flipping through the suspect's papers as if paper could reveal the soul. The man answered in halting English, fragments of place names and a name that repeated like a seed. Johann. The NCO's questions were blunt tools. Where were you when you crossed? Who arranged you? Are you an agent or a refugee? You heard him in the ward, the NCO said to Henry, as if testimony alone could decide policy. I heard a man breathe, Henry answered, steady and small. He needed care. Outside the tent, conversations hardened into judgment. A corporal from another unit spat on the ground and muttered, "Traitors get no towel." Marie, who had no formal rank but held the station's memory in her hands, caught the remark and slid a cup of broth along the table to the corporal, as if granting food might soften a stone. Small acts were a different language, handing over a cup, offering a blanket. They did not change orders, but they altered the immediate calculus of who would live through the night. The night moved through phases, wound checks, bandage changes, whispered names. Henry kept to a rhythm of rounds, check breathing, warm with wool, press dressings, note fever. A boy from the canal-side neighborhood was brought in with a farmer's pitchfork through his calf. He shuffled in with a smell of river mud and a look like a man half his age. Triage sorted him as urgent for bleeding and infection. If left untreated, he might lose a limb. The team worked on 2 patients at once, a balancing act of hands and limited supplies. "Hand me the suture," Henry called. "Here," Marie replied, offering a needle threaded with thrifted thread. "Hold the tourniquet," another medic said. The boy flinched, a small flinch that made Henry's hands steady rather than hurry. Precision mattered. A missed knot could mean infection. A wound left too open invited fever. They sewed and bandaged and used a spare of morphine to ease shock. The ampule that had been saved was now allowed to do its work. Giving pain relief to a child who had nothing to do with allegiance felt natural. Giving relief to a suspected agent felt the same, and both acts pushed against rumor. Medicine here was insistence. The human body demanded its own ethics. Rumors circulated through the tent city like birds. Someone claimed the suspect had been seen near a supply depot. Another swore they'd heard him speaking with enemy officers in a cafe. The lieutenant's clean jacket left him time to argue orders. The men who bled did not. Henry found himself listing facts rather than opinions. Pulse 80, wound clean, temperature normal, photograph found on person. Facts steadied the room. He avoided speculation and focused on what triage required. Who could be saved with what they had? Keep him under observation for 24 hours, Henry said to the charge nurse. Your call? She asked, wary. My oath, Henry answered, and the nurse nodded in the way of people who know the difference between paper and person. At mid-morning, an ambulance arrived with news of captured enemy troops needing basic care before transfer. The tent filled again. The air grew sour with too many breaths in too small a place. The suspect, Johann, slept much of the time, waking to point at the photograph folded in his shirt and to ask, in broken sentences, where he had been. Marie watched him with a tenderness born of many nights translating broken words into actions. Warm, feed, reassure. An allied, Corporal, his leg bothering him with a dull pang, watched the care and then confronted Henry privately. You give them the best you have, and we go skint, he said, frustration plain. You keep a man alive and he either becomes a prisoner or a man you can question, Henry answered. Abandon him and you lose both the chance to save and to know. The corporal grunted. The conversation was another small triage, balancing immediate needs of the unit against moral and legal obligations. Henry did not pretend it was easy. Saving a life sometimes meant stretching supplies thin and asking comrades to go without. The ledger of mercy had a physical cost. To follow the oath in full sometimes meant another man slept on a bare floor. There were nights when shelling pushed them into a shelter, boots clattering in the dark and the Red Cross flapping in wind. During one such blackout, Henry crouched by the stretched silhouette of Johann and felt for a pulse in the blind dark. Nothing but breath, thin and slow. He whispered the small medical checks under his breath. Airway clear, compression on wound, warmth, and felt the old compass of training steer him. In that blind world, where the enemy and the patient were indistinguishable in shadow, the difference between a medic and a soldier was the medic's refusal to let silence become an excuse not to care. Keep him breathing, Marie whispered. I'm watching, Henry answered. After a barrage, a supply sergeant arrived with a crate of bandages, stolen from a supply dump, silver and scentless, and a list of shortages. It was a small mercy, and yet it came with its own problem. Who would use the fresh bandages? Henry set a rule. Clean wounds first, then the worst cases, then those whose injuries promised survival if treated immediately. The rule was pragmatic, a form of mercy that triage demanded. The Geneva Convention's promise to treat wounded, regardless of side, was only as good as the people who decided its application around a lantern. A bureaucratic visit came midweek. A captain from brigade headquarters, ledger in hand, asked for reports and names. He looked at Henry like one might examine a ledger with suspicious pencil marks. We cannot be seen to be lenient, he said in a voice trained for command. Orders are orders. Our duty is medical, Henry replied. We log treatment. He slid the patient ledger across, eyes steady. The captain read the entry for Johann and then blackened his lips around a cigarette. He closed the book without comment, an unspoken acknowledgement that the written oath could outweigh the spoken order if someone chose to make it so. Marie moved through the tents like a slow current, unafraid of the way eyes watched her. She had once hidden children in attics and moved food along the lines. Here, her touch steadied the fragile. She folded a small blanket and put it over Johann, noticing a tremor in his hand. That was not pain, but the memory of cold. When she sat and mended a torn sleeve for him, the motion was unremarkable and radical at once, mending a stranger's cloth as if mending a neighbor's life. "Why do you do it?" a young orderly asked her once, while they scrubbed a stale mug. "Because no one else will," she answered simply. "Because bandage and bread are small things that stop the war from finishing someone now." The words were not doctrine. They were a domestic philosophy practiced under canvas. They were the kind of mercy that did not make headlines, yet kept people moving another day. The armband had become more than cloth. It was a marker of permission to care, a small square of white that allowed hands to cross what others insisted were borders. Each time Henry tied it on, he reaffirmed a commitment that could be used in a later report or in a later lie. A rumor reached them that a nearby unit had executed 2 men accused of passing secrets, an act meant to send a message. The rumor moved through the tents as a cold wind and settled over the bay like a threat. The medical staff felt the weight of that story in their bones. To be known as someone who tended enemies could be dangerous in retelling. It could brand a medic as soft or as a target. Henry heard a whisper behind him one afternoon. "You will be called traitor for what you did." He turned and saw the corporal who had earlier offered permission, eyes tired now with the wear of war. "Traitor to what?" Henry asked, low. "To the unit," the corporal said. "To safety." Henry thought of the bandage rolls, the ampule names, the boy with the pitchfork. He thought of the oath, the Geneva pages that promised sanctuary to the wounded. Between obedience and humanity, he had chosen the latter and felt the immediate consequence. Isolation among some, gratitude from others. Mercy had a cost. The decision to pay it could leave a man without certain shelter in the political storms that followed. One afternoon, as autumn light made the canvas glow, Johann woke and asked for the photograph back. He held the image to his chest and smiled a small, private smile that was not for the tents, but for another room in another life. Henry watched and felt a simple relief that he could not render into rank or report. The photograph was not intelligence, it was memory. It did not change the command's paper or the captain's ledger, but it changed the arithmetic for the people who had tended him. "Do you have family?" Henry asked in halting German. "A daughter," Johann said, voice thin. "She is small. She likes the dog." The image of a child and a dog in a war-torn world was an unstrategic fact. It was a fact that did not belong to propaganda or orders. It belonged to kitchens and small hands. In a tent full of men, that fact shifted the mood more than any order could. Henry noticed the lieutenant look away and then, quietly, hand over an extra blanket. Small decisions of mercy often began as private things until they became shared. As days passed, the hospital's work continued in a rhythm of wash, dress, stitch, and watch. The ledger of treatments grew, and with it, a slow accumulation of small conflicts. Who received morphine? Who got the last stretcher space? Who was moved first for evacuation? Henry traded minutes and bandage strips like currency, always balancing the immediate need against future uncertainty. The Geneva Convention offered a horizon of order. On the ground, order was improvisation and a willingness to risk paperwork for a pulse. A rumor of an upcoming inspection by military police made faces tighten. Inspectors meant questions. and questions meant someone might be punished for perceived leniency. Henry imagined the fine print of orders and the bluntness of those who enforce them. He also imagined Johann's daughter and the photograph folded under his pillow. When the MPs arrived, they asked questions about origins, about the movement of men through the ward. Henry answered in medical terms, citing treatments and vitals. He let the facts stand as their own defense. "Treatment recorded," he said as he handed over the ledger. The sergeant inspected the pages, and then the men in line, eyes cooling as she read the entries. She was not cruel, she was bureaucratic. She made a note and left without ceremony. The absence of punishment that day felt like a reprieve earned by the weight of recorded care. Small moments of human connection threaded the tents. Johann teaching a few German lullabies to a child whose family had taken refuge nearby. Marie trading bread for a small tin of condensed milk. The corporal who once spat, muttering a soft "sorry" when he saw the child eat. These were not dramatic reconciliations, but stitches in a frayed social cloth. Henry watched them and felt that the field hospital was less a place of neutrality and more a small republic where oath and mercy were negotiated daily. Even as the weeks advanced and the front shifted, the memory of that night in the church remained tangible. An armband, an ampule, a photograph. The hospital's work did not end with the convoy. It continued in report rooms, in whispered conversations, and in the quiet sound of someone stitching a wound closed. Henry found that the act of recording what he had done was its own kind of preservation. It kept the patient from being reduced to rumor. The ledger was a small archive of mercy. At times the cost was immediate. A stretcher left empty because supplies had to be shared. A night of broken sleep for those on watch. A whispered accusation from a resentful officer. At other times the cost was delayed, folded into reports and reassignments. Yet each act of care had its own quiet return. Another breath, another name spoken into dawn, a photograph kept warm in a palm. In that balance, Henry kept returning to the same quiet conviction. Medicine is a practice of restraint, and restraint can be its own strength. A squad barged into the bay with rifles ready. Boots hit canvas and voices rose. Henry stepped out, Red Cross on his sleeve, and planted himself before the stretcher. Marie gripped his arm. "Move him!" an NCO barked. "You won't take him," Henry said, calm. "He's a spy," the NCO snapped. Henry looked at the pulse under thin skin, then offered his arm. "Take my blood if you must. Today he is a patient. My oath is to that first." For a long breath, the rifle stayed down. After the squad left, Henry folded the Red Cross armband, white frayed and faintly stained, and set an empty morphine ampule beside the patient ledger. The photograph stayed in a pocket. The notes would later speak softer than rumors, and whispers would carry the choice through the tents for years. In a city of rubble, he had chosen bandage over bulletin, breath over blame. Strength is restraint. Civilization is a choice. If this account moved you, subscribe for more true stories of medicine and mercy under fire.